Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How can I just get paid for all this bullcrap? Anyway, very excited to talk with our guest on this podcast today. Before we introduce him, I want to make sure you know who the other voices are on the podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here with my wonderful co-host, Amanda Casari. Amanda, how are you?
I'm doing good. Nice to see you again, Richard. It's been a long time.
Nice to see you again. Has been a long time. Too long. I'm also doing good. I'm too caffeinated today, so sorry, everyone. That's just how it goes. But our guest today also caffeinated because they're on the West Coast, calling in from Willamette in Oregon. We have Jacob Kaplan-Moss. Jacob, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Jacob, I'm really excited to have you on today for a couple of reasons. One of them, for those of you who don't know, is that Jacob is a board member and treasurer of the Django Software Foundation. Django is, of course, a well-known framework for building web apps in Python, which is super, super awesome. Check it out if you haven't. Long-standing open source project that's like really capable of a lot of different things. Very, very cool. You also have a day job as a security architect at Littauer that we probably don't need to talk about, but it's cool. Good for you. The main reason that we're having you on today is because you recently wrote this really interesting blog post, which hit up on all the social medias and so forth, about being a maintainer. And you had a specific ask for being a maintainer. Jacob, can you talk to us about maybe that blog post and what made you write it?
Yeah, thanks. As a bit of background, there's this dynamic that happens around open source where when someone takes money for their open source work through any mechanism, someone always shows up to criticize them for it. If they launch a Patreon, they're shilling. If they raise money from a grant, they've taken money from the US government and they are now corrupt. If they do an open core sort of situation where they have an open source project and then support the business with some sort of proprietary versions or add-on, they're getting ready for a rug pull. If they work full-time on Python but are employed by Microsoft, well, their motives are suspect because Microsoft is evil. Every single time I see an open source maintainer getting paid in some way, someone shows up to give them grief for it. I even heard from one maintainer who got hate mail for selling t-shirts. Like, I can't even figure out how anyone could be against t-shirts, but I don't know. It happens. And for me, this is really personal. I think for many people, open source maintainers are sort of this abstract concept. It's a handle on GitHub that they interact with. It's sort of this person out there. They don't really think about them as a person, but I've been involved in open source for almost 25 years now. These aren't random abstract handles. These are my friends. These are people I know. These are people I know well enough to understand that this maintainer has children with complex health needs, and being on a well-funded healthcare plan is incredibly important for him. I know that this maintainer has chosen to live in a tiny off-grid cabin with very low living expenses so that he can afford to support himself on the incredibly meager donations that he gets. I know that this maintainer has decided to quit her day job and try to make a go of it just writing open source funded by a Patreon, which is not anywhere close to meeting her current rent levels. These are not abstract issues to me. These are very personal. And there was a specific inciting incident, which I don't want to mention because I don't want to call out anyone in particular, but a thing happened and I just got annoyed and frustrated and angry, and it boiled out into this post where essentially my thesis is anytime an open source maintainer figures out a way to get paid to build a lifestyle where they can be at the very least comfortable and preferably even better, we should be celebrating that. Maybe there will come a day when there is so much money in open source, there is so many maintainers getting paid that we can start to sort of more finely slice their motivations and the models behind that funding. But that is we are billions of dollars away from that reality. And right now, any way that anyone gets paid to write open source is good, no exceptions. And we should celebrate it. I think the thing I did in the post that probably made it go mildly viral and got the most pushback, but is also sort of key to my argument, and the point I'm trying to make, is I'm using this really expansive version of open source. I'm not referring to the open source licenses as defined by OSI. I'm not using the term free software as designed by the FSF. I'm using open source in this really vague, deliberately kind of wishy-washy way to refer to not proprietary. Anything on the spectrum from the most minimal licenses like the MIT license to probably most controversial, these licenses like Blue Oak and BSL and PolyForm that are open source with caveats. You can't use it if your company has more than $1 million in revenue. You can't use it if you're Amazon, etc. I am counting these licenses for this definition open source because to me, they are attempts for people to find business models around open source that will not end with them being gobbled up by a big cloud company.
I just really wanted to point out, I love that you mentioned Blue Oak. I've never heard them mentioned outside of my newsletters, like outside of the ones I get from Kyle Mitchell, who we've had on this podcast before. Go check out blueoutcouncil.org if you haven't checked it out. That's awesome. Thank you so much for saying that.
PolyForm is another Kyle Mitchell project as well, or at least he's involved with it, which is a whole family of licenses with various types of carve-outs for only non-commercial use, only nonprofits, only small companies, etc. Big fan.
Love that.
That was the article. That was the background.
Jacob, one of the things I loved so much about the initial, I think, seed for this post as well. In the post, it was, we believe that open source should be sustainable and open source maintainers should be paid. And it lists a whole bunch of ways that maintainers go about doing, and then response to it is not like that. And I also feel like the not like that response applies to like almost every single phrase you're using in that statement. So like believe, not like that. Open source, not like that. Sustainable, not like that. You were mentioning that it went viral. I'm really curious as to like the myriad of responses that you got back towards not just the licensing aspect, but like all the different areas that you're really addressing about who this encompasses and how this is brought across a community.
The bulk of the responses were very positive. A lot of write-ons, friends who are maintainers felt very seen, which made me feel good. I did get, as expected, a lot of responses ranging from criticism to just totally non-productive. From the, well, actually, folks, well, BSL is not really open source. I had quite a number of people have knockdown, drag-out side arguments, including yet again, the open source versus free software, Freedom Zero, FSF, OSI side argument, which, oh my God, I'm so tired by that argument. We've been having it for so long and it's so boring now. Luckily, most of those people weren't trying to have that argument with me. They were just sort of doing it with each other in my mentions, which was really fun. I think the thread of criticism that I'm sitting with and trying to think about is I did this thing in the post. It was a bit of a shtick where I said, I don't care about the formal definition of open source. I actually do care quite a bit about these formal distinctions. I have some serious problems with the Free Software Foundation and their leadership, but I think the 4 freedoms they defined are incredibly useful framings as we think about what software can do. I think the OSI did some amazing work setting up some boundaries around what should and shouldn't be considered open source. And I think that these are important definitions. I think for the purposes of talking about sustainability, I don't think that they matter. There's really unfortunate gatekeeping happening around these definitions. Someone said something in a comment about how the community has coalesced around a definition of open source as defined by the OSI. And I was like, wait a minute, how are you conflating the open source community with one foundation? I don't agree with this conflation of the OSI speaks for all of open source. That doesn't sit well with me. And I'm annoyed that there's this gatekeeping around what sort of can and can't be determined to be open source. I really want to see a lot more experimentation around licensing, around funding models, around stuff like that, and saying, oh, well, that doesn't count is a way of sort of dismissing that experimentation without engaging with it. We don't have a term for this sort of open-ish, kind of open, non-proprietary. I feel like if we had some sort of language that we could use to describe formal open source, but also these other things that are around the margins that encompasses some of this messiness, I think that would make this discussion a lot better. And I do regret not at least trying to coin a term so that I could use it in the article in a way that distinguished the argument that I was trying to make.
I just had to ask, are you single? Because if not, I'd love to marry you. I'm just saying, like, this is exactly what I'm saying all the time. I really appreciate this sentiment. I just had this argument last week with some other maintainers who are like, no, if it's not OSI approved, it's not open source. It's not. I've been using the term Big Tent open source, which I think works really well for that. Big Tent is like, it's just the generic, all the stuff, ethical licenses, Blue Oak licenses, dual licensing. It all seems to work for generally understanding what open means. There's a really good argument against that, which is that then having an OSI approved open source definition works really well for fighting open washing. For instance, Google just released one of their AI things as open source, but if you look at the fine text, it's like not open source. And it's really good to have a body that says, no, that's wrong. My issue is that the OSD doesn't apply to all the things we want it to apply to. And it doesn't do it in a way that actually really hurts the community at times, because again, it stops experimentation. It stops maintainers getting money for their stuff because they feel like they have to use a certain license. And then it's really, really hard for them to continue to put stuff into the commons when they want to, because they're like, well, that the OSD says I can't discriminate against multi-corporate companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm ready. We can find a state house and get married. Whenever you're down for that, just let me know.
It is so funny that you use the marriage thing, because the analogy that I've been using in my head, there's an advice columnist, Dan Savage, who coined a term monogamish to describe couples that are mostly monogamous, but not entirely. Mostly. And that's the term that keeps knocking around in my head, is monogamish, open-ish, software that is mostly obeys the four freedoms, more or less, some of the time.
So I will say that I think I come from a little bit of a different background than some folks in open source, that like the things that I used to release are not always web apps. Like it is data sets, and it is previously models and API frameworks and notebooks and like publications and code sets, for examples. It's not always things that the goal is to build a large community and have feedback and then support like an infrastructure system. Maybe it's like a finalized product. I know that folks in those kinds of communities have sometimes felt like they don't get included when the umbrella of open source, because when they're looking to create things, if it falls under, like some things are Creative Commons licenses. And so when you go to make something like that and you're talking about doing your work and folks show up who want to be very precise about your language, I also understand why that precision exists, especially as someone who has been following closely like government procurement processes, which prioritize specifically open source. I think that's where it gets for me very tricky, where I want to have that bigger umbrella inclusion, and also where I can see where systems are starting to bias towards one kind of copyright licensing. And that's curious for me how that's getting baked into these processes, partly because of the success that we've had in saying, here's the benefits. But I'm very curious, Jacob, I know that you have, like you said, 25 years and like watching these flows. Are there any concerns that you have around where things are getting baked into larger scale systems now where precision is helpful or harmful?
It's funny that you mentioned procurement. I used to work for 18F, which is a digital agency within the federal government. And we had this running joke about if you work in technology for the government long enough, eventually you come to realize that every problem is actually a procurement problem. And I definitely got to that point. And the prioritization of open source solutions is like a super good example, because I do think that's a situation where precision is incredibly necessary. The procurement rules are incredibly specific. There's so much money at stake. Imprecision can lead to decades of lawsuits. And so being able to say open source as defined by the OSI, meaning specifically these licenses, there's no way around it. I think that requirement is fantastic. I think it moves government software in a positive direction, but you just can't have a vague definition in a procurement environment. I also think this precision is incredibly important when you're talking about private company procurement and the sort of legal requirements that companies have. You have to be very precise about the obligations you expect a company using a piece of software to follow. What I think makes me frustrated and disappointed is like there's an alternate universe where the OSI sees these alternate license models coming a decade ago and canonicalizes some of them and has a Big Tent OSI approved logo or whatever we want to call it, there's a universe in which a standards body spends the time to sort this out and does the legal analysis to find out if these clauses are actually enforceable, etc. I'm disappointed and kind of sad that no one seems to be doing that work and are instead sort of trying to close the door to innovation. But yeah, I do think that precision is really important. We just don't have it for these big tent licenses.
I really wonder. I mean, I know Kyle Mitchell's been doing a lot of work on PolyForm and Blue Oak, and with other people as well. I think Pamela Chestek's involved. I'm not sure. Don't test me on that. I would really love to see, and I may have to make it, some other body start up that says, hey, we're just going to approve big tent licenses because we think that they also need to be approved. And I think that would be really, really nice. I totally agree with you there. And the whole thing around we need precision tooling seems like a solvable problem, right? We needed to have precision tooling to get to the moon. We got to the moon, right? These are things that we could work on. Then again, human systems are infinitely more complex than anything else in the world. So who knows? I want to switch the conversation a tiny bit, though, because we've been talking about open licenses, asterisk. Well, really, blah, 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 which is very similar to the, well, actually, comments that you were getting on your blog, right? And I hear those comments. Yeah, man, totally. But also, people got to get paid. Earlier, Jacob, you said no exceptions. And I wanted to push back on that because I want to go, well, actually, the other way. So I love that people want to get paid. I think people should get paid. Totally. What would you say to, say, people making open source products that are then used to, say, put kids in cages at the border? Right. This is a real use case that happened with some Ansible and Chef modules where someone pulled their open source because it was being used for state interventions to cause people harm. Do you think getting paid for that sort of work makes sense? How do you respond to those queries?
You promised hard questions, and that's a hard one. And my answer is going to be complex and nuanced and messy. No, it is something I think about a lot. I think it's a great and a fair question. It's just very difficult. So first of all, let's accept for the minute that we can draw a bright line between good and evil uses of software. I'm going to come back to that because we can't, but let's accept that there are a globally established set of good uses and bad uses. Well, if you don't want your software used in a bad way, you need to stop because Linux is used by everyone, because Python is used by everyone, because close to home, several militaries use Django, probably in some mission critical ways. So if I want to prevent my software from being used in evil ways, we need to stop writing software. Just like full stop. There's no successful piece of software that is not going to be used in ways you disapprove of. So that's just sort of the sad truth of computers are everywhere now. I do, however, fully support that maintainer's right to pull his software. I mean, the whole point of open source licenses aren't here, take this, do whatever you want with it. Even the MIT license is do whatever you want, just don't sue me, more or less. There's always conditions. Every open source license has some conditions. I'm totally fine with individuals making the decisions that they want to make in alignment with their morality. I'm not going to criticize that individual. But to come back to this idea that there's a good and a bad use of software, I just don't know how you can possibly draw that line. To some degree, this is a personal issue for me because I worked for the federal government under both the Obama and the Trump administration. So I worked for Trump. That does not align with my personal ethics and my personal morality. But I saw tons of really good work still happening. It's not like the administration changed and every single good thing the government did stopped happening. The government didn't magically become evil overnight when Trump was inaugurated. It became a little more evil, but not evenly and not everywhere. And we can't clearly draw these lines around good and evil. So we have to accept some messiness around the use of software if we're serious about releasing it under a freer license. But this is also why I'm really excited about some of this experimentation. There are people who are trying to encode ethics into software use. I have heard lawyers that I trust say that doing this through licensing is probably not the right way to do it. And I tend to agree with experts there, but I'm glad that we're trying to do it in some way. And I think that continuing to explore how we can use computers in a way that we feel is more moral is an important thing and something I think about a lot.
So I love the point at the end of the dream of the fully automated luxury gay space communism. I want to actually hopefully get to a point in our conversation around that optimism of like short, medium, far term goals from a maintainer's perspective of, okay, so there's a funding ecosystem that does exist. There are billions of dollars that are existing around this if we're taking into account industry plus foundations plus multinational and national investments and tech funds that are building around this. So I think I'm really curious from your perspective and from working in a place where you are working with an organization. Django Foundation is huge, right? It serves multiple countries. It's a global community. It's doing awesome things around trying to make sure that Django is something that has contributors and a voice around the world for the people who are working on it. And there's no quick win, right? This is a complex thing. I'm not asking for like, what's the 5 simple things we need to do? Like, what are the things that you're hoping for that both maintainers and funders can do to help close more of this gap?
Well, let's start with the DSF, because I feel very happy that you said that the DSF is huge, but let's put some numbers on that. The DSF has 3 paid employees. Only one of them is full-time, 2 are part-time. So we employ the equivalent of 2 FTEs. Our annual budget is around $250,000, $300,000. And we're one of the bigger open source foundations out there. Like, that's huge. That's not huge, man. That's a rounding error on every Bay Area company's bottom line. So what would not even the like long-term huge vision look like, just sort of a small victory look like for the DSF? It would probably be an annual budget in the low millions, $1 or $2 million a year, maybe 3 to 5 paid staff. That would represent just a massive change in our ambition, what we're able to do, what we're able to get done. A single company could get us there. A single government grant could change that, right? There isn't like a massive, heck, a single individual could donate that amount of money. I don't think we're talking about a massive increase in funding levels at the individual project level. The problem is that there are hundreds of thousands of individual projects. And I think to reach a point where I would sort of say open source as a whole is broadly sustainable is a situation where every single project has that level of funding associated with it. And a huge challenge there is like, while yes, one person who won the tech lottery could easily change the situation for a single project through a single donation, that doesn't really like scale to the hundreds of thousands of projects out there. There's a gap between sort of what we would need on an individual level for one project to win and sort of what we would need to be able to say the community as a whole is sort of large and healthy.
I totally hear that. I love that. I also think that Jeff Bezos descending from heaven to give us all money for our projects isn't a sustainable plan, or any one person just with a tech salary saying, I'm just going to fund this project.
Mackenzie Scott, just to be clear.
Yes, it would almost certainly be Mackenzie Scott. One of my sort of personal projects within the DSF is figuring out how to pursue more high net worth individuals, because a large percentage of the charitable giving in the United States comes from high net worth individuals, family foundations, that sort of stuff. And that's historically been a place where open source has actually not made a lot of inroads. There are a lot of individuals and families that made their wealth because of open source. I'm thinking about all of the Instagram millionaires out there who built Instagram, built on top of Django, made a huge amount of money when Instagram got sold to Facebook. And I think some of them individually will be a lot more amenable to donations to the Python and Django software foundations, more so than Facebook has been, right? I think it's easier to approach individuals often than it is to approach institutions. And I know that there are a lot of people who are around my age, early 40s, who are thinking about the money they've made in their career and thinking about ways to sort of give some of that back. And I think we can capitalize on that to some degree in a way that might actually be easier than approaching corporations.
I hear that. I don't know how you're going to respond to this, so I feel like I should ask it. Looking at the room, the 3 of us are American. We're all well educated. We're all white on the surface. I don't know either of your races, but I'm certainly white. And I'm just thinking about the fact that we make a tech salary in the US, which is nowhere near. It's like it's in the 1% globally, right? And so I'm thinking about when we say, oh, you shouldn't make money that way, or you should make money that way, but then you should give it all back. should we give it all back after we make money? Like, should we make sure that all of our funds go to the open source people that we depend on? And what about the rest of the stack of colonial imperialistic wealth that we also live on? Again, I'm sorry, these are not easy questions. I don't know why I'm asking you like impossible questions to answer.
I try not to judge what other people do with their money because I don't know other people's financial situations. But for me, having worked in tech for 20 years, I'm better off than most Americans and way better off than most people globally. And I do sort of feel a personal moral obligation to give some of that back. I know other people who come from religious backgrounds who find the concept of tithing resonates with them, and they give a set percentage of their income every year back to open source projects. It's complicated because I don't want to tell people what they should do. Many people who look wealthy on the surface are in fact one cancer diagnosis away from bankruptcy. And I don't feel comfortable judging people for trying to amass wealth to buffer against that. But yeah, I do think it's important to think about our privilege as people who live in developed nations and get paid by large tech companies, and at the very least consider it and think about whether we as individuals sort of feel some obligation to give back. Now, I will say, in a universe where the federal government raises my taxes so it can fund open source, that's what I'd prefer. I would prefer not to have to make these individual moral decisions. I would prefer just to have a highly progressive wealth tax and have a bunch of that money go back to open source projects. But I am very pessimistic that we'll see anything like that happen in our lifetimes.
I love that you mentioned that. I hate that we have this rhetoric in open source that's very similar to you have to recycle as an individual because that'll save the planet, as opposed to why don't we cap corporate productions of horrible materials? Like, it's not about the individual guilt. It's about the community rising to the level of sharing and pooling our resources to work together so we can have fully industrialized gates-based communism. I think that's the best. So totally agree. That would be excellent. I have one question, which is hopefully a bit less hard than the previous two I've asked, which is, okay, so someone's making money. Instead of saying, don't make it that way, what should we be saying? Do you have any suggestions for ways we can support each other with our capitalist intentions to actually fund ourselves and our lives and make sure that we have food on the table? How can we support each other?
I mean, congratulations is great. Tell me more. How's that working out for you? What can we learn? What lessons can we apply elsewhere? And I want to be clear, like, I'm totally comfortable with criticizing systems. Like, I have a friend who is one of those building open source backed by VC folks. And it's very easy for me to say congratulations to them while also saying that Sequoia can march right into the ocean. There's a very big difference between saying the system of venture capital is not particularly compatible with open source and the institutions are morally bankrupt, but then also saying, dude, you did it. Good job. Amazing. How did you convince them? What did that look like? Can other people learn from that? If there's kind of one big takeaway, it's kind of like, let's criticize institutions and not individuals. I loved the recycling analogy. It's exactly that. It's yelling at people for putting their cans in the trash can and just completely ignoring the entire rest of the supply chain and sort of industrial production system. That's exactly what I'm calling for here, is like, be super happy for the individuals, even if you are super critical of the institutions.
That was exactly what I was hoping that we were going to kind of come around back to. So it was wonderful. Thank you both.
Jacob, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really fun having you on, also enlightening. I just really appreciate all of your advice. Where can people read more about you on the internet? I know you put this blog on your own website, right? What was that website again?
Yeah, my website is jacobian.org, jacobian.org. You can also follow me on Mastodon. I'm jacob@jacobian.org on Mastodon, and you can email me if you like at that same address, and I'm kind of Jacobian everywhere on the internet. Thanks so much for having me, and I really do appreciate the tough and interesting questions. I really appreciate that we didn't sort of stay on the surface and got into some of the deeper issues here, because those are the fascinating and thorny ones.
You're welcome. Thanks for rolling with it. It's exciting to be able to actually get to cool stuff. I really like the idea that we should build another standards body that just says open-ish is okay. Here's what open-ish means, because that doesn't exist right now. And the amount of gray hairs I have because of arguments I've gotten into saying OSI isn't the end all, I look like I'm 80. I'm just saying. This is great. However, it's not over yet. Now is the time of the show where we do Spotlight. Spotlight is where we highlight other people's projects, other people's things, mentors, dog toys, guest books, whatever, really. It's just things that need light put on them. Just another part of the show that's kind of fun, kind of interesting. Huge shout out to Eric Berry, who is the person who originally said we should do spotlights. Eric, I love you wherever you are. Amanda, what is your spotlight today?
Yeah, actually, my spotlight, because like we said, we always do books. My spotlight is actually a copy of a book that's coming out next month from Catherine Nelson, who's a co-organizer for PyLady Seattle. She's got a book coming out called Software Engineering for Data Scientists. And she's been releasing chapters along the way so that folks can see them and get a good view of them. She's always so careful and thoughtful and very kind in her examples and how she approaches education and very inclusive. So I'm just excited for that to come out in April.
Thank you so much for that. My spotlight is going to be Christian Cooper's book, Better Living Through Birding. Christian Cooper was the black birder in the Central Park incident where Karen was born and said, I'm going to call the cops on you, even though he was just telling her to leash her dog. He is a really interesting person, really awesome bird watcher, and he wrote a whole book about his life. It reads like a memoir, although he's not dead yet, which is great. And it was just a nice read. I really enjoyed it. And you probably like it, even if you don't like birding or comics, which he spends a lot of his time talking about. So Better Living Through Birding by Chris Cooper. Highly suggest this book. Awesome, awesome person. Jacob, what's your spotlight today?
Wow, those are both awesome. I can't wait to read both of those. I have two. We mentioned the PolyForm licenses throughout the podcast, but just want to shout them out again. Likely, if I release another large piece of open source, it will be under one of the PolyForm licenses. I'm a big fan. More broadly, I want to talk about a book also, Carl Fogel's Producing Open Source Software. This was the book that I read when we were gearing up to open source Django and really helped me think through the early governance questions and early sort of like, what will it take to make this project successful? I kind of feel like everything we got right in the early years came from Carl's book, and it was deeply influential on a lot of the early decisions around Django in a really positive way.
Awesome. Great suggestion. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming on this podcast. Listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there's a few things you can do for us. One, you can donate. Go to opencollective.com/sustainoss. We appreciate money because just like the rest of open source maintainers, we also need to make some. And no, we're not taking away from open source maintainers because hopefully we help highlight their awesome work. And if you like this podcast and highlighting the work of people like Jacob, well, you can go and share it with all your friends. That'd be really, really cool. Word of mouth is the best way for this podcast to get shared. You can also like us on Apple, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you're getting this podcast. Just go ahead and like it. You can go on discourse.sustainoss.org where you can comment on this episode. We make a new thread for each one of these episodes. I threw down the gauntlet a couple of bits ago saying if 10 people commented, I will just be over the moon. To date, that hasn't happened yet, so I'm going to throw it down again. If 3 people comment on Jacob's podcast, I'll be very excited because it means that some of you actually listen to this incredibly fast alt text. Besides that, you can also send emails to richard@sustainoss.org or to podcast@sustainoss.org that goes to all the hosts and just say, we really love your podcast. You're really awesome. Don't marry Jacob. I want to marry you instead. That would be really, really cool. Yes, I try to throw in jokes here because I realize this is the stuff that no one listens to. But anyway, just want to say, Jacob, thank you so much for coming on. Really great having you. Best of luck, everything, and go make some money, I guess.
Thanks, y'all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.